Hello, everyone. So I am Robert Ramirez, and I am with Peacock, with NBC Universal, focused on originals. And I've been on the streaming end of, I've been on many streaming and digital distribution platforms with Netflix for 8 years and with a company called Viz Media, working on distributing and licensing and localizing Japanese anime. So I'd like to introduce our guest today, which is Denise Krieger from Riot Games, the head of localization, and Dina Behar of The Kitchen, VP of, what was that, Dina?
Business development.
Business development. So welcome. And so let's kick it off with all your path. And so I'll toss this question to Denise, and can you briefly describe for the audience, what has your career path been? How did you get into localization over the years, where you went to Netflix and now you're at Riot Games? Like, can you speak to that?
Right. So I'll try to keep it as short as I can. It is a fun journey to share with you all, but essentially I grew up bilingual. So speaking Spanish and English at home, which kind of kicked off my curiosity for other cultures and language, seeing that I had two parents that were so different and had different perspectives based on their culture and upbringing. So moving forward, I studied languages in high school. I studied Japanese. I did a bachelor's degree in Spanish and Portuguese from UCLA. And then I didn't really know what to do with that. I knew that I wanted to be in the language space, but I wasn't sure was it just translation? Was it teaching? And I think that's something that continues to be a challenge. But moving forward, I actually worked for the federal government, doing translation work for them, got to travel around. But again, there was something missing in what I wanted to pursue. So I was able to identify a specialization, a master's degree in the UK in audiovisual translation. And what audiovisual translation means is actually the specialization of understanding localization, translation in the media, in the arts. So that includes subtitling, dubbing, video game localization, understanding the work that goes into that. And so from there, I was able to move into film and TV through Deluxe Media. I did an internship through the university. And so I really got my feet wet there. And then I was hired into their LA office. And having that background under my belt, the specialization was what brought me into working at Netflix, which was an amazing journey where I really got to put all the things that I learned from my background, from the understanding that went into translation, and then also understanding how it worked into the arts. And that's how my path in localization started to grow. From there, I realized that there's so much more that goes into this. There's partnerships with engineering to build platforms to be able to scale localization efforts. Taking the example of Netflix and how they had to grow so massively. I was part of that growth and how to figure out to be able to keep quality measures within those platforms and be able to scale all the content that was being produced. And from there, I'm almost done here. From there, I thought, okay, so I have some product localization experience. I have the film and TV space, documentaries and so on, got to learn so much about dubbing, got to travel the world to see dubbing studios everywhere, so fascinating and artistic. To then, what's next? I noticed that there was always a separation between you either are in video games or you are in film and TV as it pertains to localization. So then I thought, let's look at video games. I can have, this side of expertise. Now I want to get into this other area. And so I was able to move into Blizzard Entertainment, where I got to learn a lot about game development and how it works with localization, some of the nuance there. And now I'm the head of localization production at Riot Games. And that's me.
Great. Yeah, no, I think one of the the things where for me where localization really crosses over, and especially what you're working on now, is the whole geek culture, right? So my experience is anime, and how much of that audience crosses over, and how you need to make that kind of an immersive experience. So I think it was just kind of for you this path of going in the right direction, but like how do you bring it more, bring more through video games and like that holistic experience of seamless localization. Yeah. Great.
Absolutely.
All right. So Dina, so we've known each other for a few years. So I know your story, but can you tell your story to the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny because Denise, I loved hearing your story from a standpoint of being on a content owner, content creator sort of platform side of the business. I've always been involved in localization from a service provider's point of view. So bringing it back to how I even got into this industry and towards students, I studied communication in college and got a Bachelor of Science degree in communication. And from there, I got a job working in public relations. And from there, I transitioned into television and I worked on the television side of the business. I was always in sales. I sold transmission services, so connectivity from point to point for people like that. And then one of my clients was BBC America, and I went to a vendor symposium and met a person that we all know there, and a bunch of vendors that Roy Dvorkin, and he brought me into the language localization industry, and which I didn't even know existed prior, which is pretty funny. And I sold language services and basically learned the whole business of what it takes to be a language service provider in media and entertainment space, and how that's transitioned over the years, and how language localization deals got done. And prior to Netflix becoming a global powerhouse in deciding to launch in every territory around the world, basically localization was a very niche business. And so I joined a company called SDI Media that focuses on translation, subtitling, and dubbing for media and entertainment. They were one of the bigger companies in the world about 10 years ago when I joined. And I learned everything from what it takes to be a studio in Belgium and Germany and in Los Angeles, and to being in Southeast Asia. And we provided mostly media and entertainment localization services, but also sometimes language servicing for video games, which, like you said, is different. From there, I went to a smaller audio post-production studio and helped build up their language localization side of the business, and grew their biggest prime service offering, which was English dubbing. And a lot of my clients were Japanese companies, because a lot of Japanese content gets created and has to be dubbed into English, or needs to be recorded originally into English before, if that's something they're doing. So focusing a lot on anime. And then I went to another company called Deluxe that Denise also worked at. And Deluxe is a company that provides post-production services from everything from dailies to literally package and delivery to whatever platform or broadcaster it's going to. And then I joined a smaller company called The Kitchen, which is where I am now, focusing on growing their West Coast divisions and North American service offerings, where my position is looking for identifying and targeting new business opportunities, seeing what other revenue sources we can grow within the localization services side of the business, onboarding new partners and studios to help us grow those things. And so a lot of that takes understanding how media is bought and sold globally, how deals are kind of put together, and where we can come in and help our clients with their localization requirements.
Cool. Great. And I think what's interesting, and this relates to my story, is the the kitchen coincidentally was a dubbing studio I had used at Viz Media back in like 2009 to dub a title called Blue Dragon. And so I'll take that question myself. So my experience, I graduated from San Francisco State in 2005. I became a video production coordinator at a legal video company, recording depositions, doing encoding, transcoding, and then I applied for a DVD production associate because I knew DVD authoring, I knew video encoding, and I applied for this random media company that was in San Francisco called Viz Media. I interviewed, I got the job, and it turned out to be an anime company. So they license and distribute Japanese comics and Japanese animation in the Americas, we'll say. So they would mainly target North America, Canada, but also we pick up licenses for Latin America. So we would do some Latin America dubbing, but mainly the scope was just localizing into English. So I worked with a lot of dubbing studios, DVD, video authoring studios, and I was there for about 5 years and was recruited to Netflix in 2012. So for me, what the scope became was, not just focusing on one target, one market, one language, but it became like a broader scope. So then the anime projects became like 9 dub languages, 25 subtitle languages, and really thinking about how we make those titles resonate and through, not only like localization, but also global product offerings. So like, how do we make artwork with localized titles? How do we make dubs that are in market that sound like they're actually from Brazil and not just like a random Portuguese speaker that is probably based in the US, but really making sure that those things are like really tailored to those local audiences in those markets that we're trying to distribute into. So now I'm at Peacock, which is on the cusp of maybe going global. Like we really just target English and then Spanish because we still have that Telemundo audience. So that is where I'm at now. And so let's change topics to, this is how, and we'll kick this question off to Dina. So Dina, like, how would you define, the difference between localization and then globalization? So we see all these new job postings, whether that's coming from tech or from the big streamers like Apple, Netflix, and they're really changing the term to be globalization and like not just necessarily localization. So in your point of view, how would you describe what's that difference between localization and globalization?
So I think the difference between globalization and localization is traditionally localization, and maybe globalization is sort of a new term to use for everything from, everything from how basically the world interacts with each other on an international level, because you use localization to do a translation, an adaptation, and then either a script with regards to media and entertainment, either a script creation and a recording or a subtitle. And then there's another term if you're in advertising, there's transcreation, which is you're not just doing a translation and an adaptation, you're literally transcreating, which is kind of how I would see globalization being formed, because you can't, every culture is different, right? While we live in a global world and an iPhone here is the same as an iPhone in Brazil or an iPhone in Israel, how people kind of use them or in their or what cultural status that has in a different country or person, those things have to be transcreated so that that ad or that product or that thing is functions in the country that it works for. And so I think transcreation is sort of another word for globalization, that or globalization incorporates not just localization and transcreation, but it's everything. It's how the world is interacting on an international level. And that's how I would personally define the two or differentiate the two. But that's, that's what I mean. I don't know how the tech companies are necessarily saying it, but that's how I would interpret it.
Yeah. Okay. And then how about you, Denise? How would you differentiate the two or kind of define it now that there's this new term out there?
Yeah, I would say that localization is one aspect of globalization. So the localization path is to find a way, a means to get that product to be culturally authentic and relevant in that particular market. But globalization encompasses a lot more, right? Which is, what's the strategy for that particular market? What are the differences that need to be made perhaps to the approach of the product in that market based on, that audience? So there's that kind of aspect that's a more strategic approach to just the act of translation that then is, audience facing, but the entire concept of how do you go into that market and be successful. So what I've seen in the past is that those two things have remained very separate, right? There's like strategists that are looking at, okay, we want to have this product, we want it to be global, we want it to hit this particular country or territory. So let's think about what that means to us. And then as a separate swim lane, oh, we need to localize. But what I'm seeing more recently is that those two kind of concepts or approaches, paths forward to do what is globalization, which encompasses also localization, they're starting to interconnect more. So localization experts are starting to have a seat at the table to say, let me give you some consultation on what that means and what we know from this market. I have resources where I can do some research for you. So I think we're going to continue to see more and more in the industry these trends of integration of what globalizing is that also pertains to localization. And so one really cool aspect on this is that it also spans up more opportunities for different types of jobs and different types of roles where you can come in and have a little bit of both worlds. Maybe it's a business side, right? So you understand the business of going into a new market, and then you have some knowledge on localization. And I think those types of combinations are going to be very sought after in the future as these overlaps continue to move forward.
So to kind of drive home that point, a very good example of this would be in targeting new business clients. Someone like a Lego, for example, would be a perfect example of globalization that encompasses localization. You would go in and meet with a company like Lego, who is not just a toy company, but who is a content creator, content owner, toy producer, retail manufacturer, and has an entire global roster of employees and personnel in their company that need to understand what the entire company's strategy is going forward. So there's training videos, there's manuals, there's box and docs. All of that needs to be localized into whatever market they and territory or whatever country they're going into, and translated for each of those people as well.
Yeah, agreed. And in my experience, seeing that titles, so for my experience on Netflix, seeing how just anime or any kind of original content goes into Denise's point, like a strategy about how these titles are going to be more meaningful to each audience in each country, and not only just each country, but like each language, right? Like you're that granular where you need to understand the difference between what Castilian Spanish is and then Latin American Spanish, or Portuguese and Brazilian Portuguese. And so all those things need to be taken into account, and how you make the title and kind of streamline and scale that process of making like what we call the K&Ps, so glossaries of like very specific proper nouns and so forth, and making sure that they all align, so that, to your point about Lego, how do you make sure like all these character names are the same across all the territories, that you kind of translate things so that you have some kind of meaning for the intellectual property. So you kind of build that brand and you put it out there, and it can have like this global conversation about content. So great. But great, that's very interesting, great answers. And so let's move on to the next topic. So we have all these students that come across the CSU system. They're all from different backgrounds: Spanish speakers, Chinese speakers, a lot of international students. And, you know, from my point of view, I think there's a lot of opportunity for them to maybe learn a new skill and think that there's something that, you know, that they have an innate skill, that maybe they're bilingual, trilingual, quadlingual. So with that said, like, how would you prepare students, like regardless of what your major is, for an industry in like localization? And either one of you can take this.
I'll chime in. So I think I touched on this a little bit of how there's more overlap nowadays in some of these roles, and there's more need to understand localization. So what I've been observing in the last, 10 years of being in this industry is, if you want to be a lawyer, there's room for you to understand localization. If you want to be a programmer, there's room for you to understand localization. If you want to be a UI designer, UX designer, absolutely localization. There are so many roles out there that have this collaboration and overlap with Loc, which is one of my favorite things, because I get to work with so many different people. If we want to understand, the regulations in a particular country, we want to talk about even, unions in those countries, I got to talk to someone that understands that market. And so I get to learn that, right? If I need to ensure that we build a product that's going to help us put localization requests in for all the company, let's say, then I need to work with a UX UI designer to kind of understand how we're going to build this for that particular audience. And then what happens is that they need to understand what localization is about to be effective in that role. So if you're monolingual, that's okay. So for all of you out there that say, oh, well, I'm not good at languages, that's okay. You don't have to speak another language to actually understand what localization is about. So you can spend time understanding what the processes are. I work with a lot of localization producers on my team that speak no other language but English, and they're amazing at their jobs. So there's room for you out there too. But then for those of you that are actually, bilingual or speak more than one language, you have a bit of an advantage in the sense that you can take a moment to think, oh yeah, how does this impact my experience? When you watch perhaps a movie or play a game and that line maybe could have been better, that gives you already an advantage in understanding the importance and the art that goes into localization. So if I could give a piece of advice to all of those out there, is just to spend some time just learning what it is, at least at a high level, because you have no idea how advantageous this can be in the industry. There's so many times that we're working with, let's say, engineers to build some tools on our side, and we have to spend a good 6 months teaching people what localization is, so that what they know in that role is effective, so that they can cater to the needs of localization. So again, I think if we could see more of preparation and understanding of what it is, then there's going to be more opportunity out there. What's going to differentiate you when you apply for that job? The fact that you know a bit about localization, maybe you took a course, maybe you took a module that allowed you to learn that. I think that's going to be an advantage that's going to be sought after more and more in the industry, as all of these products are mostly global. The bridges are there. There's less gaps of, before the idea of crossing, cross-cultural lines was was a lot more defined. Now it's all very blurry. So I think that this is an advantage that you can have if you learn, you know, cloak.
Nice.
Mhm.
And Dina, so if you had to hire someone, what would you look for?
If I had to hire someone, definitely, I mean, being multilingual is always an advantage. And I think that if you're not, it's okay, because as long as you understand the industry, and you understand and the needs of the business, you're going to do just fine. But if you are multilingual, there are a couple of advantages that I think present themselves, which are, you know, you can be easily put in a different territory or region to go work and possibly upstart a new operation and or studio there. I think that sometimes, and not from, I'm going to just kind of switch the question a little bit, not from a hiring standpoint, but from somebody who's multilingual. I think there's a lot of opportunities that that I know that I kind of leveraged, because my first language was Spanish. And when I wanted to find a job and couldn't necessarily find one in the broadcast media entertainment in the English network, I would look to the Latin American TV networks. And so I got my first job as an intern for Univision and for Fox News in Espanol. So I kind of got to apply all of those aspects, but through a different market. And so those things, you know, when one thing is kind of saturated, there is opportunity, if you understand the business and the area, to look into other markets to leverage your knowledge and your skill sets. So for me, what I'm looking for when I hire someone is adaptability. And like I said, always being multilingual is always a plus. You know, looking for somebody who's good, an independent thinker, who's organized, who has good follow-up. Those are all the kind of things that I'm looking for.
Great. And how would, and either of you can take this question, but how would you like kind of envision a new curriculum? So is there interdisciplinary things that like schools can be doing, or CSU universities can be doing, or like how would you envision breeding new talent? Because, you know, we know this is growing. And so from both your stances, like what do you think?
Okay, so I'm gonna start with that. One of the things that I think that I mentioned in one of my earlier answers is that I didn't realize that a career in localization was even a remote possibility to me until it was presented to me. So I think that it's so niche, and granted, it's fairly new based on how much the world has expanded or contracted, depending on which way you look at it. So for me, I think it would be very interesting to have students who understand the needs of the international entertainment and broadcast community, and who understand how when a production is created in one territory, it's actually monetized. It's monetized by selling internationally and not just domestically. And so kind of understanding how media and entertainment is bought and sold around the world, and all of the things that go into making that one piece of media come to life, from a post-production level, would be a very, very handy thing to have for me to have someone on my team do those things.
I'll add to that. I am a hiring manager, right? And I do have a lot of challenges hiring because it is a very niche industry. And the more you get into a particular focused industry space, it's even harder to find talent. So I think it's a call to action, really. It is, I think, important for perhaps university curriculums to take this into consideration, that the landscape is changing, it's evolving, right? We're moving a lot faster, technology is changing, even roles in localization are constantly changing right now. So before they were very language focused, now they're becoming very strategic, how do we build a pipeline that's effective? How do we, build cross collaboration? So it's more project management meets production meets all these different layers. So I think there's an opportunity for us to embed some courses or modules to teach this in university. I had to go to another country to learn this because I couldn't find it here. So there's more, there's more programs that are being built. I think Ms. has some in localization specifically, but there aren't enough, in my opinion, because being on the side of localization, we always have to teach localization, even to the companies we work in. I constantly have to educate. You say localization, people have no idea what you're talking about. They think it's you press a button and it's Google Translate. That is not how it works. It's very complex. It involves so many people. It's so creative. There's so many exciting things about it. You work with actors, you work with script writers and adapters. I mean, there's a lot that's touched into localization. And as we were talking about what globalization is and how more and more products out there are taking this strategy to just be global and connect the dots between all these countries and languages, then I believe that there's also an opportunity to teach what it is, even at a high level. And then from there, it could spark more interest, right? If you want to, maybe you do want to be a programmer, but you just want to understand how does that impact code? Because it does. How you code will affect how localization happens. So again, I think that there is an opportunity to at least have more of these embedded in programs, university programs of teaching, localization is a thing, and having some knowledge in it is going to help you probably perform better at your job or have an advantage to at least understanding how to ask the right questions. And I think that that's important and something that's very much needed, especially in this country.
Yeah, great. And okay, so we'll do this as a final pitch and question to students, or a question for students. But and Denise, I think you just hit on some of those points in the last answer. But I think one of the things that I've heard from a lot of students is that they don't think localization is like a creative process. So from both of you, do you think localization is creative, and then why?
Localization is absolutely a creative process, and I'm just going to be very short here, but I mean, we had a division solely dedicated to the creative side of localization, because when a translator translates something, they have to think about how it is going to be best absorbed in that language and how that original message is going to maintain its original integrity. And so you have to be very creative on how you do that and perceive that and message into its new translation. So that's all I wanted to say, is that it is absolutely creative, because we had an entire division called creative that would speak to why a translation was made that way, what the decisions were made into doing that, and how. So that was my place, but I think Denise can answer that a lot better than I could.
Well, as all of you can hear, I am very passionate about localization. I love localization. And one of the reasons I love it is because there's everything that you can want in roles in localization. So let's say if you're a very technical person, you can learn about neuromachine translation and translation memory. And like I said, working with product management pertaining to localization. So there's room for that. That's perhaps you could call it less creative. Then there's everything in between to the whole other side of the spectrum, which is extremely creative. So, you can really analyze a product, work with the creators, understand its creative intent so that you can preserve it through the localization process. So there's roles for that too. If you're a director, in a booth and you're working with talent in the translation, you're adapting lines on the spot to make it really resonate in that market. Super creative. The adaptation, that whole thing about dubbing, especially for live action, lip sync piece, it's so hard because it feels disconnected when you're watching it. Somebody's job is to sit there and try to adjust the words as much as possible to make it match those lips. It's not perfect because every language is different, and some languages are very, very far off from the original, but somebody is there just trying to figure it out for your, enjoyment in whatever country you're in. So absolutely, it can be extremely creative. It can also be, there's room for roles within localization. They're extremely technical and a lot less creative. So again, I cannot stress this more. The beauty of this space in Loc is that there is room for so many different roles, so many different areas of expertise that are going to feed into globalization and localization as a discipline.
Great. So we called this panel from localization to globalization. And so what I'm hearing, I think, is where we're landing is that localization is the process, and then globalization is the strategy that incorporates all of the process of localization. So thank you, everyone, for attending today's panel. And thank you, Denise, and thank you, Dina.